I've seen plenty of hard winters in the Garnet Creek country, and I've buried my share of calves in frozen ground. But the winter of 1887 is the one I still tell because of what it did to Calla Dunmore, or rather, what Calla Dunmore did to it. My name is Orrin Sills. I ran cattle on the bench south of the Dunmore place for 41 years, and I was 74 last autumn, so I suppose I've earned the right to tell this the way I saw it. Some of it I witnessed from my own porch. Some of it I got from Calla herself, years later, when the telling had softened enough for her to laugh about it. And some of it I pieced together the way you do out here from the tracks people leave when they think nobody's looking. The Dunmore claim sat in the throat of the valley where Garnet Creek comes down off the breaks. Emmett Dunmore had filed on it in '79 with the idea of raising horses. Good idea, wrong man. Emmett was a dreamer. He could see a 2-year-old colt in a muddy pasture and tell you every race it would win, but he couldn't keep his fences standing or his well clear. He died in the autumn of '85, not from anything dramatic, pneumonia, the quiet kind that takes a man who stopped eating regularly and left the place to his only child. Calla was 25 then. She'd been running the claim by herself for the better part of 2 years already, because Emmett's dreaming had turned to drinking and his drinking had turned to sitting, and somebody had to feed the horses. By the time he died, she could shoe a horse, split a cord of pine in an afternoon, and patch a roof in a wind that would knock a grown man sideways. What she couldn't do was make the place pay. The herd was down to 9 head, 4 mares, 3 geldings, and 2 colts that weren't worth the hay they ate. The cabin leaked. The barn leaned. The corral rails were wired together with baling twine and stubbornness. I rode over the week after Emmett's funeral and offered to buy her out. I wasn't being unkind. I liked Calla, always had, but I could see the arithmetic, and it didn't work. She stood on her porch in her father's canvas coat, which hung past her knees, and looked at me the way you'd look at a man who just asked you to sell your backbone. "I appreciate it, Mr. Sills," she said, "but I'm not selling." I tried twice more that year. Same answer, same coat, same look. After the third time, I stopped asking and started leaving things on her fence post instead, a sack of oats here, a jar of molasses there. She never mentioned them and I never mentioned them, and that was as close to charity as Calla Dunmore would allow. The town of Boxelder, 7 miles down the creek road, had opinions about her. A woman alone on a dying horse claim, you can imagine. Heck Fordham at the general store said she was crazy. Maud Tull at the boarding house said she was proud past the point of sense. The Naylor brothers, who ranched the flat below me, said she was a fool and it was a waste of good grass. Nobody offered to help her, and nobody expected her to last another winter. I expected her to last because I'd watched her work. There's a difference between a fool and a person who simply won't quit, and I'd seen Calla break ice off the trough at 4 in the morning with a mallet she'd made herself from an axle hub and a fence post, her breath coming in clouds, her hands cracked and bleeding, and never once slowed down. She wasn't romantic about it. She didn't love the suffering. She just had a thing in her, call it a root, that went down into that ground and would not pull loose. So the winter of '87 came, and it came like it meant to finish what the others hadn't. February hit the Garnet Creek country the way a fist hits a table. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in a single afternoon. Snow came sideways off the breaks, not falling so much as thrown, and the wind was the kind that finds every crack in every wall and drives a needle of cold through it. I lost 11 head that first week. The Naylor brothers lost more. The creek froze solid from bank to bank, and the road to Boxelder disappeared under 4 feet of drift. I worried about Calla. I couldn't reach her. The snow between our places was chest deep on a horse, and the wind made it suicidal to try, but I could see, on the rare clear mornings, a thread of smoke from her chimney, and I told myself that smoke meant alive. What I didn't know, what nobody knew until later, was that by the second week of February, Calla was nearly out of everything. She had a quarter sack of flour, a handful of dried beans, a little salt, and enough firewood for maybe 4 more days if she burned it slow. The horses were eating the last of the hay she'd put up in October, and 2 of the mares were already ribby. She'd been rationing herself since January, 1 small meal a day, sometimes less, and she was thinner than I'd ever seen her, though I wouldn't learn that until the storm broke. It was on the night of February the 16th. She told me the date later. She kept a calendar on the wall and crossed off the days, which is the kind of thing a person does when they're counting what's left, that she heard something outside that wasn't the wind. She almost didn't go. The cold was brutal, and opening the door meant losing what little heat the stove had built. But the sound came again, not a howl, not a coyote, not a branch breaking. A thud, heavy, close. She pulled on her father's coat, took the lantern, and went out. He was lying face down in the snow by the corral gate. A big man, she could see that even in the dark, wearing a sheepskin coat crusted white and a hat that had blown half off his head. His horse was nowhere. His hands were bare. One of them was still reaching forward, the fingers curled into the snow like he'd been crawling. She said later that she didn't think about it. She didn't weigh the flour or count the firewood or calculate what a stranger would cost her. She put the lantern down, got her arms under his shoulders, and dragged him. He was heavy, close to 200 pounds of dead weight, and the 20 yards from the corral gate to the cabin door took her a long time. She fell twice. Her knees hit the frozen ground hard enough to bruise bone, but she got him inside, got the door shut, and got him onto the floor by the stove. He was alive, barely. His face was the color of candle wax, and his lips were blue, and when she pulled off his boots, his toes were white. She knew enough about frostbite to know he'd lose some of them if she didn't warm him right. She wrapped his feet in every blanket she had, stoked the stove until it glowed, and sat beside him on the floor with her hand on his chest to make sure it kept rising. He didn't wake until dawn. When he opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was her sitting cross-legged on the floor beside him, still in her father's canvas coat, holding a tin cup of something that steamed. She'd made broth from the last of her dried beans, strained it, and kept it warm on the stove all night. "Drink this," she said. He drank it. He didn't say anything for a long time after that, just lay there looking at the ceiling, then at the stove, then at her. His eyes were dark and steady, the kind that take things in without giving much back. "Where am I?" he said finally. His voice was rough, scraped raw. "Dunmore Place, Garnet Creek." "How far from Box Elder?" 7 miles. You won't be walking it today." He looked at his wrapped feet and seemed to understand. He tried to sit up, winced, and lay back. "My horse," he said. "Gone. Didn't see one when I found you." He closed his eyes. She thought he was going back to sleep, but then he said quietly, "I'm obliged." "You're welcome to the floor," she said. "There's not much else." That was Calla. No fuss, no sweetness, no performance. She'd hauled a stranger out of a killing storm and given him the last warmth in her house, and her way of telling him was to point out that the floor was all she had to offer. His name, he said when she asked, was Harlan. He didn't offer a last name, and she didn't press for one. I've thought about that since, why she didn't ask, whether it was privacy or frontier manners, or just the fact that names didn't matter when the wind was trying to kill you both. Whatever the reason, she let it go, and he let her. That first day he mostly slept. She kept the stove going, burning the chair her father had made, then the shelf from the wall, then the boards from the broken stall door in the barn, one piece at a time, to make the wood last. She fed him broth and watched his color come back, and when he could sit up she gave him a biscuit made from the last of her flour. I want to be clear about that. She made 4 biscuits from what was left, a cup and a half of flour, maybe less, a pinch of salt, water from the snowmelt she kept in a pail. 4 biscuits. She gave him 2 and kept 2 for herself, and that was the last of the food in the house. She didn't tell him it was the last. She just handed him the plate. He ate them slowly, watching her eat hers across the room, and I believe that was the moment, though I couldn't swear to it because I wasn't there, and the heart is private, that Harlan Teague began to see Calla Dunmore. Not the way a man sees a woman in a painting, not beauty first, not the shape of her, but the way you see a fence post that's been standing in wind for 30 years and hasn't leaned. The way you see a horse that runs with a stone bruise because running is what it knows. He saw what she was made of, and it went into him deeper than the cold had. The storm didn't break for 3 more days. In that time, Calla burned every piece of loose wood in the cabin and barn that wasn't structural. She melted snow for water. She fed the horses the last of the hay and then stripped bark from the cottonwoods behind the cabin and gave them that. She and Harlan ate nothing for the last day and a half. There was nothing to eat, and neither of them mentioned it. What they did instead was work. On the second day he was strong enough to stand, and he didn't ask what needed doing. He looked around and started. He rehung the cabin door, which had been sagging on one hinge since October. He patched the chink in the north wall where the wind came through. He found her mallet, the one she'd made from the axle hub, and used it to break ice off the trough for the horses. His feet were still tender, and he moved carefully, but he moved. She didn't thank him, she didn't protest. She worked beside him, and when they passed each other in the tight space of the cabin or the narrow aisle of the leaning barn, they moved around each other like people who'd been doing it for years. He was a quiet man, not shy. There's a difference. Shy is wanting to speak and being afraid. Quiet is having weighed the words and found most of them unnecessary. He spoke when something needed saying, and the rest of the time he watched and worked and kept his own counsel. She was the same. 2 quiet people in a small cabin in a blizzard, and the silence between them wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that happens when 2 people are comfortable enough not to fill it. On the 3rd day, the wind dropped. The temperature climbed just enough to stop killing things. The sun came out weak, pale but real, and the valley glittered white from wall to wall, and you could hear the creek starting to crack under the ice. Calla went out at dawn and found his horse. It had sheltered behind the barn in the lee of the wall, and survived on the cottonwood bark the wind had stripped. It was gaunt and shivering but alive, a tall bay, better bred than anything in the Garnet Creek country, with a saddle that had silver conchos on the cantle and a bedroll that was better wool than most men's Sunday coats. She brought the horse in, rubbed it down, gave it water. She didn't say anything about the silver conchos or the expensive wool, but I think she noticed. Harlan came out and stood by the corral, looking at the valley, the white sweep of it, the dark timber on the breaks, the thin smoke from my place on the bench to the south. He stood there a long time. "I should go," he said. "Road should be passable by noon," she said, "if you keep to the ridge." He nodded. He went inside, rolled his bedroll, checked his saddle. He came out leading the bay and stopped at the porch where she was standing. "I owe you my life," he said. "You don't owe me anything. The flour, the fire, 3 days. I'd have done it for anyone." "I know," he said. "That's why I owe you." She looked at him then, really looked, not the quick frontier glance but the long one, the one that takes in the whole of a person, and I think she saw something that confused her. He wasn't a drifter. His hands were rough, but they were the hands of a man who chose to work, not one who had to. His clothes, under the trail grime, were well made. His bearing, even half frozen and limping on frostbitten toes, had a steadiness to it that didn't come from desperation. "Who are you?" she asked, and she meant it fully, not just the name but the whole question. He looked at her for a moment, and something moved behind his eyes, a decision, maybe, or the edge of one, and then he said, "Harlan Teague. I run cattle." She nodded as if that settled it, and maybe for her it did. A cattleman. He ran cattle. What else did she need to know? He mounted the bay, touched his hat, and rode up the ridge toward the Boxelder Road. She watched him until he was a dark shape against the white, and then she went inside and sat down at the table without chairs now, because she'd burned them and put her head in her hands. Not crying. Calla didn't cry, or if she did, she didn't let anyone see. She was just tired. She'd spent 3 days keeping a stranger alive on nothing, and now she was alone again with 9 hungry horses and an empty flour sack and a cabin that was colder than it had been before he came, because the chairs and the shelf and the stall door were ashes now. I got to her place 2 days later when the drifts had packed enough to ride. She was thinner than a fence rail and working on the corral gate. I brought a sack of flour and a side of bacon and a bag of oats for the horses, and I didn't call it charity. I called it neighboring, and she let me, because she was past the point where pride could feed her. I asked about the storm. She told me she'd managed. I asked about the tracks I'd seen, hoofprints heading up the ridge, too fresh to be old. A man came through, she said. Got caught in the storm, I put him up. He pay you. I didn't ask for pay. I let it go. Calla's business was Calla's business, and I'd learned years ago not to push. Winter crawled toward March. The snow softened, then hardened, then softened again. Calla made the flour last and kept the horses alive on cottonwood bark and the oats I brought, and she looked a little less like a ghost with each passing week, though the shadows under her eyes didn't go anywhere. She was waiting for spring the way a sick person waits for morning, knowing it would come but not sure what it would bring. I didn't think about the stranger again. People pass through the Garnet Creek country all the time, cattlemen, drifters, prospectors heading for the breaks. A man sheltered from a storm and rode on. It happened. What happened next didn't happen. It was the last week of March. The snow was going fast, and the creek was running brown and high, and the first green was showing on the south-facing slopes. I was on my porch at sunup, drinking coffee, when I saw them come over the ridge. Riders, a long line of them, coming down off the Boxelder Road in a column, and behind the riders cattle, not a few head a herd. I couldn't count them from that distance, but I could see the dust they raised even on the wet ground, and I could hear them. The low sound of 500 animals moving together, a sound that carries for miles in mountain air. I set my coffee down and watched. The column came down the ridge and turned north, toward the Dunmore place. At the head of it rode a man on a tall bay horse, and even at a quarter mile I recognized the horse. The silver conchos caught the sun. I saddled up and followed. By the time I reached the Dunmore claim, the valley was full of them. 40 riders I counted later, and a herd of cattle that spread across the meadow below her cabin like a dark blanket. There were also 2 heavy wagons loaded with lumber, a third wagon carrying rolls of wire and kegs of nails, and a fourth stacked with provisions: flour, sugar, salt, bacon, coffee, canned peaches, bolts of cloth, a new iron stove still in its crate. And standing in the middle of all of it, on the porch of her leaning cabin, was Calla Dunmore, holding the mallet she'd made from the axle hub, looking like a woman who'd just been hit by a train she never heard coming. Harlan Teague sat his bay at the foot of the porch steps, hat in his hand. I pulled up at the edge of the yard, close enough to hear. "What is this?" she said. "Stock for your pasture," he said. "Lumber for your barn, wire for your fences, a stove that doesn't leak smoke." I didn't ask for any of this. I know. I don't want charity. It's not charity. Then what is it? He looked at her, and I saw the steadiness I'd later come to know well, the patience of a man who has thought a thing through and come out the other side certain. "You gave me everything you had," he said. "When you had nothing, you didn't know my name, you didn't ask what I could pay. You gave me your flour and your fire and 3 days of your life, and when I tried to thank you, you told me you'd have done it for anyone." He paused. "Nobody's ever done anything like that for me, not once, and I've had plenty who knew my name. So this is payment?" "No, ma'am. This is me, asking if I can help." She stared at him. 40 riders sat their horses in her meadow, silent, watching. The cattle lowed. A magpie landed on the porch rail and looked at both of them like it had opinions. "Who are you?" she said again, and this time she meant the full question and its whole answer. "Harlan Teague," he said. "I own the Teague Cattle Company. We run stock from the Yellowstone to the Musselshell. 80,000 head, give or take, 12 ranches. I've got more money than I know what to do with, and a house in Miles City I've never liked, and I've been on this range for 20 years and I've never met a person who gave me the last of her flour." The valley was quiet, even the wind had quit. Calla looked at the lumber, the wire, the wagons. She looked at the cattle. She looked at the riders, hard men, working men, waiting in their saddles without a word. She looked at Harlan. "You could have just sent the wagon," she said. "I could have." "Why didn't you?" He looked at her, and for the first time I saw the hardness in his face shift, not soften exactly, but open, the way a door opens when someone on the other side turns the handle. "Because I wanted to see you again," he said. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the mallet in her hand, the axle hub, the fence post, the baling twine wrapped around the joint, and then she looked at the new stove crated in the wagon, and I could see her doing the arithmetic. Not the money arithmetic, the other kind. The kind where you weigh what it costs to let someone in against what it costs to keep them out, and both sides are heavy. "You can unload the stove," she said finally, "and the lumber. The cattle stay in the meadow until I say otherwise, and your men eat in the yard, not in my cabin." That was her yes. It wasn't the yes from a story, no music, no embrace, no tears of gratitude. It was a Calla Dunmore yes, which meant, "I'll allow this to happen on my terms, and if your terms don't match mine, you can load it all back up and ride the way you came." Harlan Teague touched his hat and said, "Yes, ma'am." And the 40 riders went to work. I should tell you about Harlan, because he was not what the valley expected, and the valley expected plenty. Harlan Teague was 38 years old that spring. He'd come to Montana from Missouri at 18 with $40 and a horse, and in 20 years he'd built the largest cattle operation between the Yellowstone and the Canadian line. He was not a talker. He was not a drinker. He was not a man who spent money on himself. His clothes were serviceable. His horse was good but not showy, and the house in Miles City that he mentioned was a 4-room frame house with a porch and nothing on the walls. He was hard in the way the country makes men hard, capable, solitary, watchful, slow to trust. He'd never married. He'd never, as far as anyone knew, courted a woman. His foreman, a leathery man named Tuck Ives, told me later that in 15 years of working for Harlan, he'd never seen him do a single spontaneous thing. When Mr. Teague rode in that march and told us we were moving 500 head and 4 wagon loads of lumber to a horse claim in the Garnet Creek country because a woman had given him a biscuit, Tuck said, I figured he'd lost his mind. Then I met her, and I figured he'd found it. The first week was chaos. 40 cowboys on a claim built for 9 horses, you can imagine. The meadow was churned to mud. The noise was constant. Calla's mares spooked at the cattle and broke through the corral fence twice, and the second time it took 3 of Harlan's riders 2 hours to bring them back. Calla stood in the middle of it like a woman in a river, the current roaring around her, and her feet on the bottom, not moving. She told the cowboys where to stack the lumber. She told them where to dig the post holes for the new corral. She told them the barn needed to come down before it could go back up, and she showed them which timbers were sound and which were rot. She did not ask Harlan for permission, and Harlan did not offer it. He watched her give orders to his men, and his men took them, and that was that. On the 3rd day, I rode over and found Calla at the barn site, holding one end of a string line while 2 cowboys measured the foundation. "You all right?" I asked. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her, not gratitude, not confusion, not anger. Something between wonder and wariness, like a person who's just been handed a loaded gun by a stranger and isn't sure whether it's a gift or a threat. "He's building me a barn, Orrin," she said. "I can see that. He's building me a barn with cedar posts and a tin roof and 12 box stalls. For my 9 horses. Maybe he figures you'll get more. She looked at the barn site, then at the riders, then at the new stove already installed in her cabin, already throwing heat. Nobody does this, she said. Not for a cup of flour. Maybe he's not doing it for the flour. She looked at me sharply. Calla's sharp look could cut wire. And then she turned back to the string line, and that was the end of that conversation. The cowboys stayed 2 weeks. They built the barn, cedar posts, tin roof, 12 box stalls, exactly as she described, and they rebuilt the corral with new rails and iron hardware. They strung 3 miles of wire fence along her property lines. They re-roofed the cabin. They dug a new well and lined it with stone. They split enough firewood to last 2 winters and stacked it along the south wall of the barn where the sun would keep it dry. Harlan worked with them, not supervising from horseback working. I'd see him at dawn, shirtless, swinging a post-hole digger alongside his men, or up on the barn roof with a hammer, or wading through the herd in the meadow checking stock. He was a man who knew how to work, and the physical labor seemed to settle something in him. The restlessness I'd noticed in his eyes, the look of a man who has everything he wants except the thing he actually wants. Calla watched him from a distance. She fed the crew. Once she had supplies, she cooked for 40 with the same economy and efficiency she applied to everything else. And she worked alongside them on the barn and the fences, and she spoke to Harlan when the work required it, and she was civil and clear and about as warm as a January morning. He didn't push, he didn't court her, he didn't bring flowers or make speeches or find excuses to stand too close. He worked and he watched and he waited. I asked him about it once, toward the end of the 2nd week. We were standing by the new well, watching the sunset turn the breaks orange. "You're a patient man," I said. "Not especially. You've been here 2 weeks, and she hasn't said a kind word to you." "She let me stay," he said. "That's the kindest thing anyone's done for me in a long time. Besides the flower." He looked at me, and for a moment I saw the whole of it, the loneliness, the years, the empty house in Miles City, the 80,000 head of cattle that didn't keep him warm at night. "Besides the flour," he said. At the end of 2 weeks the work was done. The barn stood solid and straight, gleaming with new tin. The corral was square and true. The fences ran clean across the meadow. 500 head of cattle grazed on grass that was just coming green, and the herd would be hers. That was the understanding, though Calla hadn't formally accepted them yet. The cabin had a new roof, a new stove, a full pantry, and a set of chairs that one of the cowboys, a man from Kentucky with a talent for woodwork, had built from leftover cedar. Harlan told his men to saddle up. They packed the wagons, gathered the remuda, and lined out on the Box Elder Road, and by noon the valley was quiet again, just Calla, her 9 horses, 500 cattle she hadn't asked for, and a barn that smelled of fresh cedar. She stood on her porch and watched them go. Harlan was the last to leave. He rode the bay up to the porch steps and sat there for a moment, the reins loose in his hands. "The herd is yours," he said. "Brand them whatever you like. If you don't want them, I'll send a crew to move them." "I'll think about it." He nodded. He put his hat on. He looked at her one more time, the long look, the one that wasn't about beauty or desire, but about the recognition of a thing you've been looking for without knowing you were looking, and he turned the bay and rode up the ridge. She told me later that she sat on the porch for an hour after he left, doing nothing. Not thinking, not planning, not tallying the lumber or counting the cattle, just sitting. She said it was the first time in 2 years she'd sat still without feeling guilty about it. I gave it a week. A week of Calla alone with the new barn and the cattle and the silence, and then I rode over with a jar of my wife's blackberry preserves. Clara was alive then, and her preserves were the best in the county, and found Calla in the barn, brushing one of her mares, looking thoughtful. "Decided about the cattle?" I asked. "They're eating my grass." "That's what cattle do." 500 head is a lot of grass. It's a lot of cattle, too, worth good money if you manage them right. She put the brush down and looked at me. Oren, what does he want? I think he told you. He said he wanted to help. And nobody gives away 500 head of cattle and a cedar barn because a woman made him a biscuit. Maybe they do, I said, if the biscuit was the last one she had. She went back to brushing the mare, and the conversation was over, but I could see the question working in her. Not what does he want? She knew the answer to that, even if she wouldn't say it yet, but whether she could trust it. Whether a man with 80,000 head of cattle and 12 ranches and a house in Miles City could mean what his hands had done for 2 weeks on her land, or whether it was a rich man's whim that would blow out like a candle when the novelty passed. I understood her doubt. I'd have had it too. 3 weeks went by. The grass came in thick and the cattle fattened and the mares foaled 2 new colts, both healthy, and Calla worked her place the way she always had, except now the barn didn't lean and the roof didn't leak and the stove drew clean and there was flour in the pantry. She branded the cattle with a simple D for Dunmore and didn't send them back. Then Harlan came. Not with 40 riders this time. Alone. On the bay horse with a bedroll and a change of clothes and nothing else. He rode into the yard on a Saturday afternoon in late April, and Calla was at the corral, watching the colts, and she saw him coming down the ridge the way you see weather coming. You can't stop it, and you have to decide whether to go inside or stand. She stood. He dismounted at the corral, tied the bay to the rail, and walked over. I'm not here to bring anything, he said. I'm here to work if you'll have me. Work? You've got 500 head and no crew. I'm a fair hand. You own 80,000 cattle. I do, and Tuck Ives runs them better than I do. He doesn't need me there. She looked at him for a long time. The colts nuzzled at the rail behind her. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals. You're asking to be my hired hand, she said. If you'll have me. I can't pay you. I know. I'm not going to cook for you. I can cook for myself. You sleep in the barn. Yes, ma'am. She turned back to the colts, and I believe she was hiding her face because what was on it, the crack in the wall, the first slip of light through the mortar she'd built around herself, was something she didn't want him to see. All right, she said, but if you're no good, I'll send you home. He worked. That is what I remember most about the spring of '87, Harlan Teague, a man worth more than half the territory, sleeping in Calla Dunmore's new cedar barn and getting up before dawn to muck stalls and ride fence and doctor calves and do every dirty, backbreaking job on a cattle and horse claim without a word of complaint. He was good at it. He was better than good. 20 years of building an outfit from nothing had made him as capable a ranch hand as any man I'd hired, and I'd hired plenty. I came by every few days, partly from neighborliness and partly from curiosity, and I watched them work together. They didn't talk much. The communication was in the work itself, the way he anticipated what she needed, the way she trusted him with the horses, which was a trust she'd never extended to anyone. They moved around each other with the ease of 2 people who have found the same rhythm, and the rhythm was work, and the work was steady, and underneath it something else was building, the way water builds behind a dam, invisible, patient, inevitable. She started cooking for him in the 2nd week. She didn't announce it. She just made enough for 2 and left a plate on the barn rail, and when he came in from the pasture he found it there, and he ate it, and neither of them mentioned it. He started fixing things she hadn't asked him to fix, a window frame that stuck, a gate latch that was stiff. The cabin door that he'd rehung during the blizzard, it had settled again, and he rehung it a 2nd time better. She started leaving the barn door open in the evenings, so the lamplight from the cabin reached his stall, and he started sitting on the barn threshold after supper, and she started sitting on the porch, and they'd be there in the dusk, 50 yards apart, not talking, not needing to, the silence between them full of the things they weren't ready to say. I told Clara about it and she laughed and said, "Orrin, that's the most bullheaded courtship I've ever heard of. They're in love and they're both too proud to say it." "She's careful," I said. "She's terrified," Clara said, "and so is he. The question is which one breaks first." Clara was usually right. It was a Sunday in May. I remember because Clara had sent me over with a rhubarb pie, and Clara only baked rhubarb pie on Sundays, when I saw it start to break. I rode into the yard and found Calla by the trough, washing her face, and Harlan up on the barn roof, replacing a nail that had worked loose. The pie was in my saddlebag, and when I handed it down to Calla, she looked at it the way she'd looked at the first sack of flour I'd left on her fence post, grateful and trying not to show it. "Clara sends her regards," I said. "Tell her thank you. She also says you should invite that man to supper in the cabin, and stop pretending you're running a boarding house." Calla's face went red, a thing I'd seen maybe 3 times in my life, and she looked up at Harlan on the roof, and he was looking down at her, and for a moment neither of them moved. "Clara can mind her own kitchen," Calla said, but there was no anger in it. I left the pie and rode home, and I didn't see what happened next, but I heard about it later, the way you hear about things in a valley with 6 families and no secrets. She took the pie to the barn that evening. Not a plate on the rail, she carried it in herself, with 2 forks, and sat down on the hay bale across from his stall, and they ate rhubarb pie together in the lamplight while the horses shifted and breathed in the dark. "Tell me about the house in Miles City," she said. So he told her, 4 rooms, a porch, nothing on the walls, a kitchen he'd never cooked in because there was never anyone to cook for. He'd bought it 7 years ago because a man with 12 ranches was supposed to have a town house, but he'd slept there maybe 20 nights total, and every one of them was lonelier than a line camp in December. "You don't like it," she said. "I don't like what it is," he said. "An empty house is just a building. A building isn't a home." "What makes a home?" He looked at her. The lamplight was warm on her face, and her hair was loose. She usually kept it tied back for work, and her hands were on her knees, and the scar on her left palm from the axle hub was white in the light. "Someone who'd give you her last flower," he said. She didn't answer. She picked up the pie tin and the forks and went back to the cabin, and I think she cried that night, though she'd never admit it and I'd never ask. But the next morning she told him he could eat in the cabin. That was the first wall down. The others came slowly, the way they do with careful people, not in a rush, not in a collapse, but one stone at a time, each one weighed and set aside deliberately. He told her about Missouri, about his mother, who died when he was 12, and his father, who'd drunk himself into the grave by the time Harlan was 16. About the $40 and the horse and the 20 years of building something out of nothing, which was, when he said it, the same story she'd been living, only his nothing had turned into plenty and hers hadn't, and the difference was luck, not worth. "You worked harder than I did," he said. "I had better grass." She told him about Emmett, about the dreaming and the drinking and the sitting, about the horses that should have been great and weren't, because Emmett couldn't keep a schedule or a fence, about the day he died and the relief she'd felt, a relief so tangled with grief that she couldn't separate them, and the guilt of that relief had sat in her chest for 2 years like a stone. "He loved you," Harlan said. "He did. And he left me with nothing but a leaning barn and a name on a claim. You've got more than that now. Because of you." "No," he said, "because of the flower. You had that before I showed up." She looked at him across the table where she'd put her head in her hands the day he rode away, the table that now had 2 plates and 2 cups and 2 chairs, and something in her face changed. The wariness didn't leave. I don't think it ever fully left. Careful people carry it like a scar, but it shifted over, making room for something else. I didn't give you the flower because you were worth saving, she said. I gave it to you because you were dying. I know. It wasn't about you. I know that too. So why did you come back? He set his cup down and looked at her the way he'd looked at the valley from her porch steps in March, steady, certain, settled. Because you're the only person who's ever done something for me that had nothing to do with who I am or what I own. You didn't know I had a dime. You thought I was a drifter who got caught in the snow. And you gave me everything. That's not kindness, Calla. That's the rarest thing I've ever seen. And I've been looking for it for 20 years without knowing what I was looking for. She was quiet for a long time. The stove ticked. One of the horses blew in the barn outside. I can't be bought, Harlan. I know. That's why I'm here with nothing. You're sitting in a barn you built me. You burned your chairs to keep me alive. We're not even. And there it was, the thing Clara had predicted, the break, the moment when two stubborn people stop circling and stand still. Not a kiss, not a declaration, not a scene from a stage play. Just two people at a table telling each other the truth and finding that the truth was enough. He moved out of the barn that night. Not into her bed, that's not Calla's way, and it's not the kind of story I'm telling. He moved into the cabin's second room, the one that had been Emmett's, and Calla cleared it out for him without being asked, and neither of them called it anything but practical. The barn's too cold at night, she said, when I noticed the change. It's May, I said. Mountains, she said, and went back to work. They were married on the 1st of June, in the yard, with me and Clara and Tuck Ives, and two of the Naylor brothers as witnesses. The preacher came from Box Elder in a buggy that got stuck twice in the creek ford, and Calla wore a blue dress that Clara had altered from one of her own, and Harlan wore a clean white shirt and the same work pants he'd been wearing all spring, and the ceremony took 4 minutes. Afterward, Calla served coffee and Clara's cake on the porch, and the magpie that had watched the whole thing from the corral rail flew down and stole a crumb, and Calla laughed, the first time I'd heard her laugh in 3 years. Harlan didn't move his operation to the Garnet Creek. He didn't buy Calla out. He didn't fold her claim into the Teague Cattle Company or put his brand on her horses or change the D on the cattle. What he did was come home. He kept the 12 ranches. Tuck ran the outfit. But the house in Miles City stayed empty, and the claim on Garnet Creek became the place Harlan Teague came back to at the end of every trip, every negotiation, every season on the range. He came back to the cabin with the repaired door and the new stove and the cedar barn, and to the woman who'd given him her last flower, and to the life they built there. Not his money and her poverty yoked together, but two people who'd each come from nothing and found in each other the thing that nothing else could provide. The claim prospered. Of course it did, with 500 cattle and Harlan's knowledge and Calla's work, and the grass in the valley running green to the creek. But the prospering wasn't the point. The point was the way they were together, which I watched for years from my place on the bench. They worked side by side. They argued. Calla had opinions about fencing and Harlan had opinions about breeding stock, and neither of them was inclined to surrender. But they argued the way people argue who respect each other, with evidence, not volume, and with a resolution that came from the work, not from one of them winning. They were quiet together. They were steady. They were the kind of married that looks, from the outside, like two trees growing close enough that their roots have tangled underground, and neither one would stand as well alone. She never took his name. She was Calla Dunmore on the claim, Calla Dunmore in Box Elder, Calla Dunmore on every document she signed. He never asked her to change it. She earned that name, he told me once. I just earned the right to stand next to it. Children came, 2 boys born in the cabin, delivered by Clara and the Box Elder doctor. The older one had Calla's jaw and Harlan's patience, and the younger one had Harlan's quiet and Calla's refusal to quit. And both of them grew up on the place and worked it and loved it and are there still, if you ride up the Garnet Creek Road today. I watched all of it from my bench, the barn going up, the fences, the cattle, the wedding, the boys, the years. I watched a hard man find the one thing his money couldn't buy, and a hard woman find the one person who understood that her poverty was never her measure. I watched them build a home from a dead man's dream and a stranger's flower, and the kind of love that doesn't announce itself. It just shows up at dawn and works until dark, and is still there when the lamp goes out. And I've thought about it plenty in the years since. What made it work? What made a woman with nothing give everything she had to a man she didn't know? And what made a man with everything come back with 40 riders and then strip all of it away and stand in her yard with nothing but his hands? People have asked me, and I've never had a neat answer, because neat answers are for stories and this was a life. But I think it was this. Calla didn't give the flower because Harlan deserved it. She gave it because it needed giving. And Harlan didn't come back because she'd earned a reward. He came back because, in a life full of people who wanted something from him, she was the first person who'd given him something without wanting anything at all. And that kind of grace, once you felt it, is the thing you spend the rest of your life trying to be worthy of. She's gone now. Died in the spring of '09, sitting in the same chair on the same porch, looking out at the valley she'd refused to leave when the whole world told her to go. Harlan lasted 3 months after her, just long enough to see the colts born that spring, just long enough to sit in the barn he'd built her, in the stall where he'd slept that first month, and remember what it felt like to be a stranger who got lucky. They're buried on the ridge above the cabin, side by side, where you can see the whole valley and the creek and the breaks beyond. Clara picked the spot, years before she needed it herself. There's no stone. Calla didn't want one, just 2 mounds of Garnet Creek earth and a fence Harlan built from the last of the cedar. And in the spring, when the grass comes in, you can't tell where the graves end and the land begins. That's how it should be. The land was always the point. I'm an old man now, and I've told this story enough times that the words have worn smooth, like river stones. But I tell it again because it matters. Because in a country that grinds people down and spits them out and doesn't care whether they were kind or cruel, a woman gave her last flower to a dying stranger, and a man came back with 40 riders and they built a life that lasted. And the flower was more valuable than all the cattle in Montana, and both of them knew it. That's the Garnet Creek country. That's what I saw. And that cup of flour, the last one she had, the one she didn't have to give, is the richest thing I've ever known about.